I'll go straight to the point. Lately, we've heard many convincing voices speaking of carbon sinks, carbon dioxide absorbents, nature's potential of absorbing our CO2 emissions. In Swedish politics and in media, we can read that Swedish forests can absorb over 80% of the total Swedish fossil emissions, capable of absorbing the emissions from all cars in Sweden. Can this be true? Is it realistic? The trees are absorbing CO2 when they grow. The coal transforms from CO2 to other chemical compounds. It turns into wooden material. When burning or by decay, the same amount of CO2 that was bound when the tree grew is released into the atmosphere again. So, don't they miss an important part in the calculation when they talk about the carbon sinks? It's really quite easy to understand. During millions of years, our planet has developed and formed to find balance. Balance on the ground, in the sea, and in the atmosphere. Balance in gas concentrations and substances to make perfect conditions for all forms of life. Periods when the CO2 concentration has varied depending on changes in nature. Changes caused by the nature itself. CO2 concentration balancing in harmony with nature. During the last tiny part of our planet's history, we have added coal from earlier time periods. We are burning forests and biomaterial from millions of years ago. Material that doesn't belong in our time. That's why the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere has risen dramatically. We all know about this by now. After many years of denial, we all know that something must be done immediately. And it is important that we do the right things. There will be no second chance. So, are our politicians leading us on the right track? Are the carbon sinks realistic solutions to stop the climate catastrophe? How many trees are needed to bind the CO2 from all the oil we are burning? I have done a simple calculation. The energy in 1 liter diesel is the same amount of energy that is bound in 4 liters of wood. 1 liter diesel is consumed by the car within about 15 minutes. It takes a lot more time for a 4-liter tree to grow. Here we can see the oil consumption 2021, 35 billions of barrels. When comparing the energy in diesel and wood, we can calculate the area of the forest corresponding to the same amount of oil. The result shows that it is almost exactly the whole area of Sweden. The problem is that the forest doesn't grow at the rate in which we are burning the fossil energy. It takes about 100 years for the forest to absorb the CO2 we add during 1 year. That means that if we stop all fossil consumption tomorrow and plant trees on an area as big as Sweden, then CO2 will be absorbed and become material in the growing trees. When the forest is fully grown, it has bound the whole amount of CO2 we've added from the fossil fuel we consumed during the last year. So after 100 years, we have reduced the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere to what it was 1 year ago. But then we must not use another drop of oil starting tomorrow. If we continue to use the same amount of oil for just another year, we must plant yet another forest, the area of Sweden, to absorb that CO2. Unfortunately, this does not concern only the oil, but also the coal and nature gas consumption that produces the same amount of emission each. We must plant a whole lot of forests on our planet. Trees that never can be cut down and burned, because then the CO2 will be released into the atmosphere again. And where on earth will we find that vacant space for growing these forests? Everyone understands that this amount of planting and effect to the ecosystem is totally irrational and absurd. The politicians promise to turn the still increasing CO2 into the negative is unrealistic. Instead, it leads to false hopes and wrong action plans. In the calculations, they compare how much CO2 a tree can absorb to the figures of our fossil emissions. But the forests have always been there. It handles the CO2 that is supposed to be there. The CO2 that you and I exhale and everything that is included in the cycle of nature. We add coal from oil that was formed 300 million of years ago. Coal that was never meant to be extracted. Those who think we can put it back again has not understood what it's all about. Unfortunately, we must live with the CO2 concentration we have caused in the atmosphere. We can only stop the increase of the CO2 concentration, and that can only be done by stopping the use of all fossil energy. The conversion from fossil energy to electrical energy is good in many ways, but the electricity must be produced in a green way. 60% of the world's energy production comes from fossil-driven electrical power plants. Therefore, we must see to it that all energy consumption is minimized so the green electrical energy is enough for the entire world until we have established new green energy. I might be wrong, and no one will be happier than I if it turns out that the forests all of a sudden starts to reduce the CO2 concentration, despite continuing fossil consumption, only because someone has done some insufficient calculations, and just by promises from our politicians, and just by writing it in a climate plan.